Josie Calloway sat trembling on an empty platform. 7 months of letters and $40 spent chasing a man who already had his wife 2 counties away. That was the whole of it, the whole shameful arithmetic of her life reduced to a number. 1 trunk, 1 ticket, and a promise that had turned out to be worth exactly nothing. She did not yet know his name was a lie. Built on top of another lie, she only knew that the sun had gone down, that the last train had come and gone, and that the man who had sworn to meet her at this station had not come at all. If a story like this one keeps you coming back, week after week, consider becoming a member of this channel. Just tap join beside the channel name. It costs nothing extra to watch, and it helps keep these Wild West stories coming. It had begun, as so many turns of a life do, with a newspaper folded the wrong way on a Mill-Town counter. Draymore, New Hampshire, in the spring, smelled of wet wool and machine oil no matter which way the wind blew, and the light that came through the mill windows was always the same thin, grudging gray, filtered through soot before it ever reached the floor. Josie had worked the looms there since she was 16, ever since her parents had gone within a single hard season of each other, her father to a fever, her mother to a grief that never quite let her eat again, and left her a small inheritance, a single trunk, and a silence in her chest that never fully went away no matter how many years passed over it. She had read the advertisement columns of the Prairie Bulletin the way other women read scripture, not so much for information, as for the small private mercy of imagining a different life for a few stolen minutes each evening. There were advertisements from men in Kansas wanting a cook, men in Nebraska wanting help with 6 children already living, men in places she had never heard of wanting, in language too careful to be honest, simply a woman's body in the house. She had read those columns for the better part of a year before she ever worked up the courage to place one of her own. Young woman of good character and domestic skill, seeks correspondence with an honest man of the West, matrimony, the object. She had written those words herself one November night, with her hand still aching from the day's shift at the loom, feeling both bold and faintly ridiculous, and had folded the paper and carried it to the post office before the courage could leave her the way it usually did. Of the dozen replies that trickled back over the following month, most had been either too flowery or too blunt, men who wrote of loneliness in a way that made her uneasy, men who wrote of a wife the way they might write of a good mule, useful and easily replaced if it went lame. But the letter from a man who signed himself Silas Prentice had been different from the very first line. His hand was tidy and square on the page, his sentences plain and unhurried. He wrote of a ranch outside a town named Larkspur, Wyoming, of a creek that ran clear and cold through the driest weeks of July, of needing a partner with a steady hand and a good heart rather than a decoration for his parlor. He described fence lines and cattle counts and the particular hard blue of a Wyoming sky in a way that felt, oddly, more honest than any romantic language could have managed. And something in the plainness of it settled into her like a key finding its lock after years of trying the wrong door. They wrote back and forth for 7 months, through a winter and into the following summer, and Josie found herself timing her walk home from the mill to pass the post office twice some days, just in case. Silas Prentice's questions were thoughtful ones, and his replies carried across 3,000 miles of paper and ink something that felt very much like tenderness. In his third letter, the one she read so many times the ink began to blur at every fold. He had met her small, embarrassed question about the house with a single line that sealed something inside her for good. The kitchen window, "Faces east," he had written. "You will have the morning sun on your face while the bread rises." It was such a small promise. It carried, for a mill girl who had never once in her life woken to anything but brick and shadow, the entire weight of a world she had never known and had come, slowly, and then, all at once, to want more than she had ever let herself want anything before. She was 24 years old when she boarded the westbound train, her parents' small inheritance spent down to $40 careful dollars, a single trunk riding in the luggage car, and Silas Prentice's last letter tucked into her reticule like a passport into a wholly different life. "I will be at the Larkspur station to meet the afternoon train on the 9th of June, he had written. "I am a tall man, plain in dress, dark-haired. You will know me." The journey took 4 long days, the green tamed hills of home, giving way first to flat country that seemed to run on without any end at all, and then, on the last day, to mountains that rose up ragged and indifferent against the sky. A landscape that did not appear to care one way or another whether a young woman's hopes came true. For the first time since she had mailed that advertisement more than a year before, a small cold thread of fear worked its way through the warm certainty she had been carrying for 7 months. The conductor announced the stop in a flat, bored voice that did not begin to match the size of what it meant to her Larkspur. "This is Larkspur." Josie gathered her things with hands that would not quite hold still, smoothed the gray traveling dress she had chosen with such deliberate care, and stepped down onto a platform of splintered wood that smelled of dust and pine, and something wild she had no name for. The train hissed behind her like a great tired animal drawing breath, and then, with a lurch and a long, mournful cry of its whistle, it pulled away and left her standing entirely alone in a country she had never once set foot in before that afternoon. The platform was empty, a single bench, a shuttered station house, a water tower standing sentinel against a sky already beginning to purple at its edges. No tall, dark-haired man in plain dress. Josie sat on the bench, folded her hands in her lap, and made herself believe that a horse could have thrown a shoe, that a calf could have wandered into the wrong pasture, that 1,000 ordinary things might delay an honest man on an honest afternoon. She was good at waiting. Her whole life, in one way or another, had been a long apprenticeship in it. The sun sank behind the western peaks. The air turned from cool to properly cold. The station agent, a stooped, weary man, came out just long enough to lock the little building, tipped his hat to her without a word, and trudged off toward the scattered lights of the town, leaving her alone with a trunk and 7 months of letters that had begun, very quietly, to feel like something other than the truth. He was not coming. The thought did not arrive as a shock. It settled into her stomach like a stone dropped into still water, spreading its rings outward until it had touched everything she owned in the world. She pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders and refused, with the last scraps of her pride, to let herself cry. That was when she heard hooves in the dark, slow and unhurried, and a rider came out of the gloom leading a pack mule loaded down with supplies. He drew up short of the platform and simply looked at her for a long moment, the brim of his hat low, his shoulders broad and solid even at rest, a dark shape against the last of the dying light. She expected him to ride on the way any sensible stranger would. Instead, he swung down, his boots landing soft in the dust, and crossed the platform toward her with the unhurried steps of a man who never wasted a single motion in his life. "Ma'am?" His voice came low, rough at the edges, but not unkind. "Last train's been and gone." "I know." Her own voice came out smaller than she meant it to, thin against the wind. He studied her, the worn traveling dress, the single trunk, the rigid stillness of a woman holding herself together through sheer force of will, and pressed her for nothing further. He did not ask who she had been waiting for, or why they had not come. Something in the quiet, patient way he waited made her feel he already understood those were questions that belonged to her alone, and to no one else, least of all a stranger on a dark platform. Town's a fair walk. He nodded toward the road, dark now beneath the first stars. There's a boarding house, clean, run by a decent woman. She looked from him to that dark road and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after so many hours of dread, that she had nowhere else in the world left to go. "Thank you. My name is Josie Calloway." He nodded toward his horse. "Can't offer you a ride, not with the mule loaded the way it is tonight, but I can carry your trunk." He lifted the trunk onto the mule's pack with an ease that showed considerable strength, lashed it down in a few practice motions, and started walking without waiting to see whether she would follow. She fell into step beside him, and for a long while the only sounds between them were harness leather creaking and their boots scuffing softly through the dust. The lights of Larkspur rose slowly out of the dark. A general store, a saloon leaking tinny piano music into the night, a scatter of small houses with lamps burning gold behind their curtains. A hand-painted sign above the gate read, "Odell House, Rooms for Travelers." Vrit stopped there and set her trunk down on the porch without ceremony. A woman opened the door before he could so much as knock, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron, stout, gray-haired, with a pair of sharp, assessing eyes that seemed to miss nothing at all. "Everett Marsh. Didn't look for you till next month." Her gaze slid past him to Josie, taking in the exhaustion and the dust of 4 days' travel in a single sweep. "Mrs. Odell." Everett gave the smallest nod. Tabitha Odell's expression softened at once into something almost maternal. "Of course. Come in, dear. You look done and completely." Before Josie could properly thank him, Everett had already turned back to the older woman. "Put her week on my account." And then, before she could form a single word of protest, he touched the brim of his hat, swung back up onto his horse, and disappeared once more into the dark the way he had come, leaving her standing on a stranger's porch with nothing left to offer him but a gratitude he had not stayed long enough to receive. The room upstairs was small and plain, but scrubbed clean, a narrow bed under a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a chipped pitcher, one single window looking out over the quiet street below. Josie sat on the edge of the bed and let the careful control she had held on to through 4 days of travel finally crack apart entirely. She cried for the fool she had been, for the east-facing window she would never now see, for the terrifying total aloneness that had become, in the space of one long day, the only certain thing left in her life. The week that followed passed in a haze of quiet shame. She took her meals in the kitchen with Mrs. Odell, helping with the washing and the mending to earn her keep, learning by careful degrees that her landlady was also the town's postmistress, a woman whose front parlor doubled as the hub of every scrap of news that passed through Larkspur. Mrs. Odell posed no prying questions about the man who had failed to appear at the station, for which Josie was more grateful than she could ever have properly expressed. In the evenings, over the washing up, the older woman would talk about the town instead, who had married whom, whose cattle had wandered, which families had come through hard winters, and which had not, and Josie found, without quite meaning to. She saw Everett Marsh only once that week, riding into town for supplies on a gray gelding, his face set in the same serious line she remembered from the platform, never once glancing toward the boarding house as he tied his horse outside the general store. She watched him from her window, a solid, self-contained man who had paid for a stranger's shelter and then vanished like a passing shadow, and felt something stir in her chest that she could not yet put a proper name to. Something she told herself firmly was gratitude and nothing more. On the seventh day, with a knot of panic tightening in her chest over what on earth she would do next, she heard his voice below, low and even, in conversation with Mrs. Odell. A knock came at her door a few moments later. "Marsh is here to see you," Mrs. Odell announced, her face carefully unreadable in a way that made Josie's heart lift and sink at the same time. Josie found him standing by the parlor window, hat in his hands, filling the small room with a quiet, grounded presence that had nothing to do with the size of him. "Miss Calloway," he wasted no time on pleasantries of any kind. "Odell tells me you've a good head for figures and a fine hand with a pen." She glanced at her landlady, who gave the smallest of nods. Josie had, in the evenings, quietly helped balance the boarding house's own books, a task that had been a rare comfort in a world gone entirely to chaos around her. "I am competent." The words came out plainly, without embellishment. "I am not." The bluntness of it startled her more than any softer approach would have. "I've a ranch to run. The books have gone neglected 4 years running, near enough. It's a disaster of ink and unpaid receipts, and I need someone with sense to make order of it." He looked at her directly, and she understood in a flash that the admission had cost his pride a considerable deal. "I've a small room off the main house you could use for the work. Fair wage, plus your board here with Mrs. Odell, same as now." It was a lifeline dressed up as a plain business arrangement, honorable and entirely without pity of any kind. It was work. It was purpose. It was, more than anything else, a reason to rise in the morning that had nothing at all to do with a man in Sweetwater who had never once meant to come. "Yes." The word came out of her with more force than she intended. "Yes, Mr. Marsh, I will do it." His ranch lay 8 miles out of town, tucked into a valley carved by the very creek Silas Prentice had once described in his letters, a bitter irony she chose, for her own sake, not to mention aloud. The house itself was simple and sturdy, built of hewn logs with a wide porch facing the mountains, a man's house through and through, clean but bare of any softness whatsoever. The room he showed her had clearly been a storage space until quite recently, crowded with spare tack and half-emptied crates, though it did have a good solid desk and a window that caught the morning light generously. He gestured at the bare walls, looking almost apologetic about it. "It will do," she told him, and meant it completely. Her new life began in earnest that same week. Each morning, she made the long walk out from town as the sun rose over the eastern ridge, and each evening she walked back as it set behind the western peaks, and the ledgers themselves proved every bit the disaster he had promised. 4 years of a hard-working man attempting. Receipts were stuffed between pages at random. Figures were scrawled sideways in the margins, in a hand growing more frustrated with each passing month. Whole seasons were simply missing from the record entirely, as though he had given up on them out of sheer exhaustion. But for Josie, it was a puzzle she could solve with patient hands and a clear head, and she worked at it with a quiet, fierce concentration that filled the long empty hours with something very close to genuine purpose. Everett was rarely in the house during the daylight hours, He was out mending fence, tending his small herd, doing the 1,000 ordinary tasks that ranching demanded of a man with no hired help but his own 2 hands. She came to know him mostly by the sound of his departure at dawn and his return at dusk, the creak of the porch step under his boots, the particular way he set his hat on the peg by the door each evening, without ever once looking to see if it landed true. On the 3rd morning at the desk, she found a tin cup of coffee sitting on the corner nearest the window, black and still faintly steaming, with no note beside it and no sign of him anywhere on the place. She drank it slowly, and it warmed her a good deal more than coffee alone could rightly explain. The next morning, it was there again. It became, without either of them ever once remarking on it aloud, a small daily ritual between them, an unspoken kindness that came to mean more to her over the passing weeks than any pretty word Silas Prentice had ever set down on paper. In the afternoons, he sometimes worked out on the porch, mending a bridle or sharpening a blade against the whetstone, and she would watch him from her window without quite meaning to look at all. She learned the particular economy of his movements, the way he never wasted a single motion, the set of his shoulders when a hard day's work had worn him down past speaking, the way he would sometimes simply stop and look out at the mountains, as though drawing something from them that plain words could never quite give him. He was a man who spoke through work far more fluently than he ever spoke through language, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was learning to read him easily, the way she might learn a second, quieter tongue. He, in his own turn, watched her, pausing in the doorway for a drink of water, noticing the way the afternoon light caught in her dark hair while she bent over the ledgers, watching the chaotic stacks of paper on her desk shrink, week over week, into neat, ordered columns of figures. The house felt different with her in it. Less empty than it had been in longer than he liked to count. Autumn came early to that valley, the aspens along the creek turning gold almost overnight, and with the changing season came a small unlooked-for softening in the shape of their days. One afternoon, a month into her work there, he came in from the porch and set a small, carved wooden bird on the corner of her desk without a single word, a meadowlark, its head tipped as though caught mid-song, the detail in it far finer than she would ever have guessed his rough, weathered hands capable of producing. "It's beautiful!" She looked up in genuine surprise, turning the small bird over in her palm. He only shrugged, a flush climbing slowly up the back of his neck. "My hands get restless of an evening," he muttered, and left before she could think of anything else to add. She kept the little bird on her desk after that, and whenever the old loneliness crept back in on a slow afternoon, she found herself running a thumb over its smooth wooden feathers, as if it were a small promise of some different, quieter kind of life than the one she had come west chasing. Word of her had gotten around Larkspur by then, of course, the way word travels through any small town, whether it is invited to or not, and she began timidly to be included. A nod from the storekeeper's wife, an invitation to a church social one. She wore her one good dress and sat near Mrs. Odell, and whenever it arrived late, hat in hand, still smelling faintly of the range, several of the older women exchanged glances that Josie pretended very hard not to notice. She finished the ledgers in early September, 4 full years of chaos folded down at last into neat, orderly columns of income and expense, and presented the finished book to him one evening out on the porch, where the light was just beginning to go soft and gold. He took it from her, his rough fingers surprisingly careful, on the pages, looking not at the sums themselves, but at the plain order she had made of them, page after patient page. His voice came low at last. "Thank you, Josie." It was the first time he had ever used her given name aloud, and it settled strangely well between them, like a word finally spoken correctly after months of stumbling clumsily over it. "The work is finished." Her own voice stayed quiet, and the words hung there between them, heavier than either of them had quite meant them to be. The reason she had made that long walk out to his ranch every single morning no longer existed. He closed the ledger slowly, turning it over once in his hands. "There are other things about the place that want sorting." It was not quite a question, though it felt very much like one. "I could see to the pantry," she offered, "and the mending, if you'd allow it." Yes, the word came a beat too quickly for a man usually so unhurried. The mending. And so she stayed on. The arrangement shifted after that into something unspoken and increasingly comfortable, a rhythm neither of them named aloud, for fear, perhaps, of breaking it. She was no longer simply his bookkeeper. She cooked the evening meal now, and they ate it together in a silence that had long since stopped feeling awkward, and had begun instead to feel like something closer to companionship. She mended his shirts by lamplight, her needle working steadily through the tears and frays of hard labor, and the house began, slowly and without any single turning point she could point to feel less like his house and more like theirs. She bought a pot of geraniums in town one week with the last of her own small wage and set it on the porch rail, a small, brave splash of red against the weathered gray wood. Everett never once remarked on it directly, but she caught him watering it faithfully one gray morning when he plainly thought she wasn't watching from the kitchen window. The truth about Silas Prentice had, by then, become a kind of ghost in her mind, a faded, foolish memory she allowed herself to visit less and less often as the months rolled on. Wyoming had stripped a certain girlish naivety out of her over that first long year and had replaced it, patiently, with something harder and far more entirely her own. But ghosts, as it happens, have a habit of returning precisely when they are least invited. It happened on a cool afternoon that following September, in the corner of Mrs. Gapardus. Odell's front parlor that served the whole town as its post office, while Josie waited her turn to buy a stamp for a letter to an old friend back in Draymore. Mrs. Odell was sorting a fresh bundle of mail behind the counter, her lips pursed in concentration over the handwriting. Odd. She held one particular envelope up to the window light, turning it this way and that. "Don't get much out of Copper Ridge County way. Not in this house." She squinted at the careful address. For a Mrs. Ruth Prentice. That'll be from her husband, I expect. Silas works the railroad line out that direction, I hear tell. Sends a letter every single month, regular as clockwork, never once misses. She paused there, still turning the envelope over slowly in her fingers, half to herself. Funny name, Prentice. Only ever heard it the one other time before, and I couldn't, for the life of me, tell you where. Her voice trailed off as she looked up at last and saw every trace of color drain entirely from Josie's face. In that single instant, Odell, with her sharp eyes and her even sharper instincts, honed by years of standing behind that same counter, understood the whole of it at once. The matrimonial advertisement Josie had never once mentioned in over a year of living under her roof. The quiet shame that had clung to this girl for months on end without ever once explaining itself. Oh, you poor child. All of the older woman's usual briskness fell away entirely, replaced at once by plain, unguarded sympathy. Hearing the name Silas Prentice spoken aloud in that ordinary parlor, tied now forever to a real wife and a real life that had never once included her, broke something open in Josie that she had honestly believed long since healed over and scarred smooth. It was not, strangely enough, the heartbreak she might once have expected to feel. It was a cold, clarifying anger, sharper and cleaner than grief. He had not simply changed his mind somewhere along the way, or grown afraid, or been kept away by some ordinary misfortune of weather or health. He had built a careful fraud out of 7 months of her hope, writing tender lies from a life he already shared entirely with somebody else, purely, it seemed, for his own private amusement. She walked the 8 long miles back to the ranch in something close to a daze, dust rising in small pale clouds around her boots with every step she took. She had to tell Everett the truth of it. Their whole arrangement had been built from that very first dark night at the station on his quiet charity toward a woman he believed had simply been left behind by an ordinary man's failure of nerve. He did not know the real shape of it, that she had not been merely abandoned, but deliberately, calculatedly deceived from the very first letter onward. She found him out at the corral, tightening a loose rail with the flat of a hammer, and stood a long moment simply watching his strong, capable hands at their steady work before she could bring herself to speak at all. This man, his calluses were real. The coffee he left wordless on the corner of her desk every single morning was real. The quiet they had built together in the evenings, sitting side by side without needing to fill the silence, was real. Everett. He set the hammer down at once and turned, and something in her face made him go entirely still, giving her his full attention without a single question. She laid it all out for him plainly, Mrs. A. Odell's discovery, the wife waiting in Copper Ridge County, the 7 months of careful letters that had never once been anything but a cruel private game to a man who already possessed everything he had ever claimed to want. She set the whole ugly truth of it down between them, her own voice level and controlled, betraying almost nothing of the storm still turning underneath it. He stayed quiet a long moment once she had finished, his jaw set hard, a muscle working steadily in his cheek, his eyes fixed on the far mountains and burning with an anger that belonged in that moment entirely to her rather than to himself. "We could write the sheriff over in Copper Ridge." His voice came out flat, controlled. "There's laws against a man doing what he's done to you. He could be made to answer for it properly, in front of a judge." She had already turned the idea over more than once on that long, dusty walk home. Justice was tempting in its way. But she pictured plainly what it would actually cost her. The letters read aloud in some crowded courtroom, the long investigation, her own name passed from mouth to mouth across 2 counties as the foolish, jilted mail-order bride who had believed a stranger's pretty lies. And what good would it truly do me? Her voice came out so quiet it was almost lost entirely in the wind moving through the corral rails. It won't hand me back a scrap of my pride. It won't undo one single thing that's already been done. The foolishness of it was mine for believing him so completely. Let that debt stay mine alone to carry, and let me finally be done with it for good. He turned his gaze away from the mountains and settled it fully on her instead, and truly seemed to see her for the first time in a new light, the quiet resilience that bent under weight without ever quite breaking, the considerable strength it took to choose her own dignity over the cold satisfaction of revenge. Whatever vague, protective fondness he had been carrying toward her for months without examining it too closely, settled in that single look into something far more certain and far harder to walk back from. He had grown so entirely used to the smell of fresh bread in his own kitchen, to the quiet scratch of her pen across paper in the evenings, to her simply being present in the rooms of his house, that he had not fully understood how essential all of it had become to him, quite suddenly, as genuinely unbearable. That evening they sat together on the porch, as they always did by then, watching the first stars begin to prick through a deep indigo sky, one at a time. But the quiet between them felt different that night, charged now with everything that had finally been said. "Josie," he broke the stillness first, his voice rougher than she was used to hearing from him. He set both hands flat on his knees, as if to steady himself for what came next. "I've been thinking on it a good while now. This house, it's been quiet a long time, longer than I ever properly let myself notice before you came. Since you've been here, it feels different, feels right, somehow, in a way I can't rightly explain. I'm not a man with fancy words, not like the ones in those letters you carried out here. I'm slow to see a thing sometimes, slower than I'd like to admit to any living soul, but I see this one plain enough now." He rose from his chair and crossed to the porch rail, looking out into the dark rather than at her, as though the words came easier that way. "This is an empty house, Josie." He turned back at last to face her directly. "I'd like it if you'd stay on here, not as my bookkeeper any longer, as my wife." The crickets, the wind moving softly through the pines, every ordinary evening sound seemed to fall away entirely for a moment, leaving only his plain question hanging in the cool night air between them. It was not a desperate plea, nor a poet's practiced declaration. It was a solid, unadorned offering, made in the only honest way he knew how to make anything at all. She rose and went to stand beside him at the rail, studying the strong line of his jaw in the starlight, the steadiness that never once seemed to leave his eyes even now. He had not offered her an east-facing window or a creek running cold through the driest weeks of summer. He had offered her, simply and entirely, himself, honest, unhurried, without a single ounce of pretense. It was, she understood now, with a certainty that startled her, by far the better promise of the two. "Everett," her voice came soft, but certain down to its foundations. "I was hoping you would ask me that." A slow smile broke wide across his face, transforming it entirely, the first true, unguarded smile she had ever once seen from him in all their months together, one that reached all the way up into his eyes and outshone. Their courtship, once properly begun, proved every bit as unadorned as the proposal that had started it. It was built out of shared suppers where the talk turned, little by little over the following weeks, from ranch business into their own separate pasts. He told her of his parents, who had built this ranch out of nothing but stubbornness and hard weather, and now lay buried together in the small Larkspur cemetery under a single shared stone. She, in turn, spoke of Draymore, of the mill's endless clatter that had once seemed as permanent as breathing, of a girl who had once dreamed of a quiet place with an east-facing window, and had never once imagined it would come to her this way, by this crooked road. On Sunday afternoons, they walked the length of the creek together, and he taught her the names of the wildflowers crowding its banks, and showed her the fresh tracks left overnight by deer, and it became, in its own unhurried fashion, a slow weaving together of two lives that had each been solitary. They were married 3 months later, in the small, white church at Larkspur, on a bright, clear morning in December with frost still silvering the grass along the walk. Mrs. Odell stood as her witness, dabbing steadily at her eyes throughout the whole short ceremony with a lace handkerchief she had clearly brought along for exactly that purpose. Josie wore a simple blue dress she had sewn with her own 2 hands over 3 careful weeks, and Everett wore his one good suit, looking faintly uncomfortable in its stiff collar, but entirely resolute about the whole affair. Half the town turned out that morning to watch, their faces carrying a quiet, approving satisfaction. They had watched this whole plain, unhurried story unfold over the better part of a year and a half. As they stood together on the church steps afterward in the bright, cold light, Everett took her bare hand in his, rough and calloused, and holding hers with a gentle certainty that felt to Josie like the truest home she had ever once known in her whole life. If these Wild West love stories are ones you look forward to, tap join beside the channel name and become a member. It truly helps. Their first winter as husband and wife settled in hard and early that year, snow closing the pass above Larkspur for the better part of 6 weeks, and Josie learned what it meant to keep a house through a Wyoming winter, banking the fire before dawn, breaking ice on the water trough, watching Everett come in half-frozen from checking the herd with a patience that never once cracked, no matter how bitter the cold turned. They spent those long, snowbound evenings by the fire, Everett mending harness while Josie worked at her own small sewing, and she found, to her quiet astonishment, that she had never once in her whole life felt less alone than she did in that small, snow-locked house at the edge of the world. 6 years later, the evening light lay long and golden across the porch of the Marsh Ranch house. Josie sat in her rocking chair with the small shirt of a 6-year-old boy spread across her lap, her needle flashing steadily in the fading light as she worked a torn seam back together. At her feet, a 4-year-old girl with her father's serious eyes, and a tangle of dark curls arranged a careful line of pebbles in the dust, entirely absorbed in her own small, important work. Everett came and settled into the chair beside his wife with the weary sigh of a man far more content than tired, the smell of wood smoke and honest labor still clinging to him after a long day spent branding calves down in the lower pasture. He reached over and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the touch familiar and easy after all these years of ordinary evenings just like this one. Their son came barreling around the side of the house just then, chasing a hen with a stick clutched tight in one fist, hollering with fierce delight at the top of his lungs, "I'm going to get you, Wyatt Marsh. You leave that hen be." Everett's voice carried a low rumble of amusement rather than any real reproach at all. "She's got more sense than you do, boy. I'd wager money on it." The boy skidded to a stop in the dust, grinned a gap-toothed grin at his father, and let the stick fall from his fingers, coming instead to lean his whole weight against his father's knee. Everett's hand settled on his son's head without either of them thinking much of it at all, the way a gesture becomes so thoroughly worn in over the years that it no longer needs any real noticing. Josie looked out over the whole little scene, her husband, her children, the home. The 2 of them had built together out of nothing but honesty and quiet, patient work over 6 long years. The house was no longer quiet, not by any measure. It was full now of the ordinary noise of a whole family laughter, small squabbles over nothing, the steady thud of bare feet on the wooden floors at all hours. She glanced past the corral toward the east, where the kitchen window she now stood at every single morning of her life faced exactly the direction a stranger's careful letter had once promised her, All those years and all that heartbreak ago. It was a strange, almost tender thing to sit with, how one man's lie had somehow pointed her, in the end, down the one road that led her straight to something entirely true. "The light's lovely this evening." Her voice came soft, and Everett looked over at her and understood at once, without needing a single further word, that she was not only speaking of the sunset behind the ridge. He reached over and took her hand in his thumb tracing slowly across her knuckles in the fading light. "Still can't rightly believe how long it took me to sort out those blasted ledgers of mine." A teasing glint rose slowly in his eye as he said it. "You were slow." Her mouth curved into a smile. She didn't bother to hide. "It's a good thing you had someone to fix your accounts." "It's a good thing I had someone to fix me," he corrected, quiet and entirely earnest under the teasing, and she laughed softly and let her head come to rest against his shoulder as the last of the light slipped from the sky and the first stars came out one by one over the darkening mountains. They sat there together as the evening settled fully into a clear, cold night. The house behind them, warm and bright and utterly full in every corner, not an empty house any longer, not by any measure a person could name. It was, Josie thought, watching the lamplight spill golden across the porch boards, the truest definition she had ever known of the word home. A place built not on paper promises and pretty borrowed letters, but on the steady, unhurried love of one good, honest man. If Josie and Everett's story stayed with you tonight, stay a while longer. There is always another quiet corner of the West worth visiting, and always another two people worth rooting for all the way to the end.